Welcome everybody to Knowledge as We See It, the show where we explore what engagement means to us in the workplace. I'm your host, Daniel Nathan. Today we're going to be hearing from Jon Ingham. Jon is the director of the Strategic HR Academy. Based on his experience as a consultant, facilitating HR practitioners and teams to develop their strategic capabilities, Jon is going to talk to us and tell us what he thinks the secret is to maintaining employee engagement in a hybrid workplace. Jon, it's great to have you on the Knowledge as We See It podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
It's wonderful to be with you, Daniel. And a wonderful, important topic. And in fact, sort of both sides of it, I think, are really important. So clearly employee engagement, and particularly from a more hybrid perspective as well. Your listeners might like to know. So my last book, The Social Organisation, was very much around both the physical and the digital workplace and the need to bring them together. I didn't predict the pandemic. I didn't use the term hybrid or anything, but something that I've been passionate about for quite some time.
Jon, it would be great if you can start off by giving us a little bit of background to yourself, how you got started in your career and how you got to where you are today with the academy.
Thank you. So most of my career has been in HR. Like a lot of HR people, I came into the profession from elsewhere. So I was a chemical engineer, an IT consultant. I was doing a lot of change management work. And I guess it was that sort of change side that led to my refocus into HR. I was hugely interested in using technology to support business as an IT consultant. But progressively, I just realized that the big issue I was confronting time and time again were sort of people ones. And that was around the end of the 1990s, when personnel was evolving into HR, and I just became very excited by the opportunities in this profession, which I think are growing and growing. And there's more and more insight, more and more opportunity, and the Strategic HR Academy is designed to help HR practitioners take advantage of those by presenting the range of best practice that exists and new insights based upon my experience and reading and thinking and so on that helps HR practitioners do things differently, contribute better, and have more impact on their businesses.
It's fascinating to hear that you've been involved in HR, as you say, since the 1990s. How has the landscape of HR and personnel use, as you call it, how has that changed over the last 30 years?
It's not totally different because the things that we do to manage and develop people are still what we were doing 30 years ago. But the way that we do them has clearly changed significantly during that time. And I think the rate of that change is increasing. Even just going back 5 years ago, clearly the hybrid world has changed the way that we do HR as well. But this increasing focus on people that we saw, particularly through a focus around employee experience for a couple of years before the pandemic, all of the work going into well-being during the pandemic, and the way that businesses are, I think, treating their people differently now. Just over these 5 years, the world has changed completely. This is at the time we were recording this is a really interesting time that in HR as elsewhere, everybody's talking about their trends and predictions. And it's just hugely exciting that there's so much change, so much opportunity, so much potential to do things differently and to have more value, and a growing recognition, not just within HR, but across business, that HR people, are the center of business success. The issues that we're confronting within HR are the big business issues for our time. So it's a wonderful time to be doing the sort of work that I am.
So let's talk a little bit about those big issues, those big business issues that are making HR and employee engagement really challenging. What kind of issues are companies facing today?
Well, clearly we're going to be talking about engagement, and that's huge. To me, it's that people centricity trend that I was talking about before. That's behind most of the other things which are happening, and is taking that existing focus on engagement within HR, within businesses, and taking it one or two steps further. So I was already saying, we're already shifting our focus to employee experience over the last couple of years, which I think was useful. But one of the points that I'm increasingly focused on and increasingly clear about is that whilst that's a useful evolution as far as business is concerned, I think for employees, most of the work we're doing around employee experience really isn't touching the sides. It's not making a difference to employees. It's not really why they come to work. So I still think we're at a fairly early stage in developing a more evolved approach to being more people-centric. And I'm encouraging organizations, firstly, to think much more about enabling their people, freeing up their people, moving towards self-managing organization, for example, to give people more autonomy and enabling them to contribute more effectively. And also getting much more in touch with people's own needs, so that we're not just helping them do business processes more effectively, but we're helping them achieve their own processes. Whatever they're in business to achieve, that we're helping them do that through the work they're doing in our own organizations. And I think there's huge potential in that space.
Amazing. And if we talk a little bit, you alluded to it a few moments ago, employee engagement, and we're going to move on to that now. Why is it today so challenging to engage with employees in the workplace? What is it that businesses are finding challenging?
Gosh, well, I mean, for a start, engagement has always been challenging. Going back to when I was entering HR, we were struggling with, we didn't call it engagement so much, but employee satisfaction. We knew that most of the people in most organizations had issues about the way they were getting work done. We've sort of progressed that approach. We've developed more sophisticated approaches for surveying engagement, for understanding, for responding to it. And yet, in most survey organisers' reports, employee engagement responses around the world haven't really increased very much during that time. And then you add in all of those new things around experience and people centricity, which are becoming more important. All of that means it's more and more challenging to do something that was quite difficult in the first place. And absolutely, working from home, remote, hybrid, all of that, I think, does make things more difficult because, we're not together and we're doing things in a more difficult way, and technology's great. And, I dread to think what would have happened if the pandemic had happened sort of 5 years before it did, because we really didn't have the technology tools to be able to manage around remote working at that point. And, we sort of got through it, but not in the same way. And going back to my book, the social organization, looking at competing through the relationships between people, those relationships have suffered. And particularly this idea of weak ties. So the people that we're not working with in our teams sort of all the time, because in a sense, those relationships have got better because we've needed to be more proactive about spending time with the people that we need to spend time with. But it's all of those other people that we used to bump into, those serendipitous connections, those have suffered significantly. And there is a school of thought to suggest that, okay, productivity has perhaps increased, at least for a while, but that improvement has been largely on the back of sort of accumulated social capital through to the start of the pandemic, which has deteriorated since. And it's that brokering social capital, the relationships between people that we don't know that well, which is at the core of things like innovation and change, for example. So at the very time that we need to innovate most to sort of progress through and beyond the pandemic, the capability that's going to enable us to innovate and change is at its weakness because those ties have suffered. And engagement's just one aspect of the impact of that. So things like being intentional about our connections, our communications, which I think have always been a significant part of engagement, are even more important now. And sorry, that's a rather convoluted response to a potentially, well, perhaps very simple question. But I think the added bit, the bit that we really need to focus on even more now than we have in the past is around relationships, helping people connect and sort of feel part of a coherent culture within their organisation.
And listen, your answer was not convoluted at all, and you touched on a point that I just want to expand on a little bit. And relationships, as you say, we'll call it the employee-employer relationship. And as we know, COVID has certainly tested the resolve of HR departments and as you say, personnel departments to really, well, almost rebuild that connection, right? Because switching from an in-office to a hybrid, in some cases fully remote organizations, the relationship between the employer and employee, from what we're hearing and what we're feeling, is completely changed, right? Because as you say, employers now need to be considerate towards the social and family situation, if you like, of organizations, of employees in a way that they never had to before, right? Children were off work. People now need to consider whether it's worth their time and their money to now travel to the office. And is that, less frequent office visits now, is that acceptable for the organization? If it's not, do they need to be considerate towards the employees' feelings about forcing them back into the office in some cases? So I think it's really been tested there, the relationship. And I think what we're hearing is the employer-employee relationship now has become more equal in a sense. In the way, as I say, in the compassionate approach that an employee now has really sort of been forced upon them with the way that they feel about employees and the way that they engage with employees. So I think the relationship element, as you say, is really been critically tested, if you like, in recent years. And again, what we're hearing is those organizations who are being supportive of their employees, right? And being, as I say, showing an element of compassion towards them and understanding and having that relationship on a more equal setting, are seeing better engagement with their employees, better engagement levels, better productivity, higher employee satisfaction. And I think those organizations who have steered their ship most successfully during COVID are those who are more open to their employees and, as I say, having that relationship on a more equal footing. So it's good that you touched on the relationship element. In terms of increasing and maintaining high levels of employee engagement, what kind of strategies are you advising your organizations and your clients that you're working with? What kind of strategies should they be putting into place to increase those employee engagement levels?
Okay, so what is around that relationship? I mean, so firstly, if we're trying to rebalance to help meet people's needs as well as the business needs, we need to understand what those needs are. So spending time with people, understanding where they're coming from, what they're trying to achieve, without that backdrop, it's very difficult to sort of progress. We can't use a sort of cookie cutter approach and treat everybody in the same way, and that sort of sheet dip type approach that we've used in the past. We have to understand where people are coming from, personalize our approaches, both in terms of what we do and how we do it, and really start to give people what they need. The other thing, I think, which again is perhaps a little bit newer based upon what I was talking about, again, is giving people that sense of being in an organization, even though they're still not together, and enabling people to create, maintain, and develop those weak ties I was talking about. I think it's hugely important at the moment that organizations encourage the development and growth of networks within inside their organization. So not just the teams, the functional teams, the agile teams, whatever they are, but enable people to find connections across the rest of the organization, both for their own sort of personal commitment and engagement, but from a business perspective, and as I was saying before, innovation change perspective as well. And there is a difference between those types of relationships, I think. So from a team perspective, the whole focus is about getting work done and doing that in the most effective way. And yes, doing that in a human, people-centric way as well. But from a network perspective, networks operate based upon humanity and interest and reciprocity and all of those sort of things. So you have to give people more freedom to network with the people that they want to network with. So things like sort of the way we communicate and the use of visual tools and so on, that all plays into helping people navigate the organization in a more people focused way rather than the sort of work focused way that teams operate in.
How difficult is it, though, to actually measure success of engagement strategies and measure employee engagement in general?
Yeah, not that difficult. I mean, as I was talking about before, that as we moved from a focus on satisfaction to engagement, we developed engagement surveys that focused on the attributes of people, so their engagement, their advocacy, their propensity to stay in the organisation, their motivation, and so on, as well as the things we were doing in organisations. And we learned how to correlate those things to work out what was particularly important and so on. With the move to employee experience, that has advanced even further. So we now have the use of digital tools to help us understand sentiment and so on at different parts in an employee journey. So we've got lots and lots of data. Yeah, to me, it's not. The data isn't the issue. Yeah, we know what the issues are. It's taking action against them and doing things differently and developing different ways to organise that will lead to greater levels of engagement. Because otherwise, we get the data, we take some specific tactical actions against them, but nothing really changes. So I think there's a signal that we can extract from all of that noise, perhaps, about sort of changing the way that we organise, changing our relationships with people. To break forward and really make a difference to the way that people are motivated in their organisation. And the other thing I think is a lot of that data is, well, I don't know. One of my so look, this is just me. This isn't HR because HR's got a lot more data and analytics focused over the last decade or so. My own view is that in life and business in general, but possibly particularly in HR, the more things, the most important things tend to be more difficult to measure. And therefore, if we're really going to move the needle on what's really important, we have to measure things which are able to be measured, but we also have to be comfortable managing things that we can't measure, because otherwise we end up not doing the most important things. And therefore, although we do have lots of data, a lot of that data is around sort of operational, transactional type issues. We don't necessarily have the data on the things which are really, really important. So I think the other aspect of measurement, as I was saying before, is about talking to people, and having conversations and getting a qualitative or subjective feel for them and what's important that isn't necessarily going to be shown in engagement surveys. And responding to those more qualitative items as well.
So speaking with employees, really, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
And I guess so, and it makes sense. Why wouldn't it? But let's say an organisation decides not to take that approach, and let's say an organisation decides to do nothing about employee engagement. What are the potential pitfalls? What are the challenges that an organisation may face with a disengaged workforce?
Well, it partly depends on the level of disengagement. Clearly, I mean, they'll still operate. They'll still, generally work to achieve what they want to achieve. But I try not to use a metaphor of a machine for an organisation because I think organisations are different. But it loses traction, it loses power. You put your foot on the accelerator and the car is a bit sluggish. It's not moving forward as expected. It's this thing about discretionary effort in particular, I think. So look, I mean the most popular or the engagement survey that tends to get used and talked about, particularly in sort of in this connection is Gallup, and there's lots of strengths about their survey. But they do, or at least commentators on Gallup tend to talk about their responses around engagement. They sort of talk about 30% of the people around the world are disengaged, and
Yeah.
that means that these people are just coming to work and doing the mere minimum they can get away with. It doesn't really, the Gallup survey is based upon 13 very specific questions about whether you have a best friend at work and that sort of thing. There's nothing inherently in that means that people who respond negatively to those questions are, detractors from the organisations, are trying to sabotage their
Yeah.
organisation. I don't see that. I talk to lots of people in lots of organisations, not just the HR people, and most people in most organisations want to do a good job if it's made easy for them. So disengagement doesn't necessarily, I don't think it leads to people wanting to sabotage your organization. It just means a reduction in discretionary effort. People might be able to do this, or with a little bit more effort they could do it differently, and perhaps they won't bother doing it differently because it's going to be harder for them to do that. They take the easy path. So it's just reducing the effectiveness of the organization. And as I was saying before, there's increasing recognition that people and the organization of people are the most important aspect of business these days, and therefore, that's always been a serious issue, but it's absolutely to the fore at the moment. If okay, strategy, technology, all of these other things are important, but if your people aren't totally, aren't connected with what the organization needs, and they're doing what they can to make the organization succeed, then that's a serious issue for any organization these days.
There's a term that I guess has become quite popular over the last, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, and the term is quiet quitting, right? The term generally means, right, that employees are not emotionally or intellectually attached to their job. They come in for the paycheck and then they go home at the end of the day. Is quiet quitting is it a legitimate trend? Is it something an organisation needs to be aware of and perhaps even worried about at all?
I must admit I tend not to use the term because I think people infer different things based
Yeah.
upon it, and also I don't think it is that new. People have always responded to organisations in different ways, and some will absolutely push themselves as far as they can go. Others will do their job as well as they can without necessarily sort of giving their whole to their role, and some people will do the mere minimum they can, and there's a whole range, a full spectrum of different behaviours in between those. But yeah, the key thing that I'd encourage organisations to focus on is their organisation, their business is the people within it, and the more that they can help people feel aligned and connected and motivated by what they're doing, the more successful the organisation is going to be. And it relates back to what I was saying before about the key questions in business these days are HR questions. This one about how do we really create an environment where people will motivate themselves to do their work is the big question for HR and businesses, and it's and because again we're dealing with, this is the sort of stuff that can't be measured that easily. All of these really important issues about how we encourage people to be able to perform effectively. They're deep, difficult questions that we're still only really getting to sort of understand effective answers to. Organisations need to explore that. They need to be attuned to it and interested in it, and again, it's this shift towards a more people-centric approach, because if we just treat everybody in the same way, then we're not going to get everybody. There are motivators that everybody experiences in relatively similar ways, but everybody has different motivations as well. So unless we start talking to people about those and responding to them, then we're never going to engage people to anything like the extent that they could be engaged.
Absolutely. A great response there. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a topic that is, I guess it's kind of like we would call it Marmite, love it or hate it, and that is virtual or remote meetings. Right. Of course, we've seen a huge applications like Zoom and Google Hangouts and Microsoft Teams have really sort of, if they hadn't already, they've really taken off since COVID in terms of bringing a hybrid workforce together. But there are people and the people who love the engagement that they get from virtual meetings, and those who see it as a waste of time, perhaps not being used in the most efficient way. Could you talk to us and maybe give our listeners and viewers some advice on best practices for running and holding meetings and communicating with a hybrid workforce?
Okay, thank you. So I've already referred obliquely to a couple of things that relate to this. So firstly, I was saying that one of the ways that we could progress beyond employee experience is to give people more autonomy. And part of that is just reducing organisation drag, reducing aspects of the organisation that just stop them working effectively. And a big part of that is too many meetings. So, absolutely, this is something that organisations should be thinking about. At the same time, if we want to build relationships between our employees and the workforce, getting them together in the best way that we can is hugely important. So meetings are important, and they're a big time suck. And the way I think we get around that is managing them proactively and intentionally, and understanding that meetings are different and they have different objectives, or there are different objectives within a single meeting that can be split into different things. And that's the case when we meet physically in person, as well as sort of when we meet virtually using technology tools as well. It's part of the same issue to me, that we should be thinking about, why do people need me? How do they need me? And how can that be done effectively? And a lot of that, a lot of meetings can be done without meeting. So I really like this idea of the no meeting, which is you put an agenda on in the technology somewhere, and you go through what needs to be reviewed or decided, and people have an online chat about it. And if they get to the solution before the meeting, then you don't need the meeting, and the meeting is called off, and everybody's saved some time. At the same time, developing those close, connected relationships which make organizations work, which have suffered since the pandemic, doesn't happen over email or on Slack, or it needs a more human approach. And some of that, I think, does need to be in person. And that may be more difficult these days because of the pandemic and so on, or because organizations have become more globalized and they've recruited people from the other side of the world, because that sort of worked in a remote environment, and now it's starting to constrain their effectiveness a little bit. Those people need to meet at some point, and you can do a lot working remotely, but you need that social capital to begin with that you can then draw off from. And so perhaps that you bring people together for 2 days every year, and then the rest of the year they manage virtually. I think that's quite a nice idea. There's one organisation I'm aware of that, they get their whole, it's a small organisation, but they get their whole workforce and each employee's family together into they find a big sort of mansion on Airbnb, and they take it over for 3 or 4 days or so on, and they get everybody in their families all together. So there's no work, it's just about human connection. And so you've got that sort of email on one side of the spectrum, and that sort of family-oriented communication right on the other, and then there's probably a sort of zone where you can use technology in the middle as well. And some of that technology, the focus is about doing it as efficiently as possible, and for some of that technology use, the focus is about connection and being human. So absolutely, it's wonderful. We couldn't have had. Thank you for your questions, Daniel. I think they've been brilliant, and they've stimulated my thinking. And we couldn't have had that result, this level of conversation via an email exchange or on Slack. It just wouldn't have worked in the same way. And it probably wouldn't have worked in the same way just on an audio discussion on the phone. The fact that we can see each other and we can react to each other is part of, well, it's part of producing a good work result, but it's also a good part of developing a relationship between us. We shouldn't try and do everything over video because it's slower than trying to do some things via email. But where there's a human connection and we can't meet in person, then a video communication comes into its own, and it's a really, really important part of engagement in the hybrid workplace.
Absolutely, and you've mentioned a few times there, perhaps leveraging technology, to replace those human-to-human contacts. Besides things like calls, Zoom calls, and what the case is, what other kinds of technology do you think organizations should be embracing to try to, as you say, perhaps even reduce the amount of meetings, and also just to try to facilitate better communication and better collaboration without the use of meetings, be it in person or virtual? What kind of technologies are out there?
So there are technologies like yours that enable that more human connection to be made. I have to say, increasingly, I think in organisations we need to sort of grapple with this idea of paradox that we need to do sort of potentially oppositional things at the same time. So, in order to facilitate more human connection, we need to sort of do more things in a more standardized, efficient type of way as well. So I think the thing that's missing from most organizations is asynchronous communication. You look at most of the firms which grew up remote prior to the pandemic, they use asynchronous communication as the basis most of the time. And then when that isn't enough, then they bring in other technologies like video-based, or they bring people together in person. But most of what they do can be done in the background, enabling people to sort of get on with their lives and do work at the time which makes sense for them in the way that they want to do it, and still doing work effectively without the sort of the impact on people's personal lives that meetings can have. That would be, I mean, that would be my major sort of point about my major regret from the pandemic. Well, other than all of the other stuff and all the people who died and everything, which is clearly much more important, but sort of confined to a work context. My biggest regret is we've not learned the lesson of asynchronous communication. I think we still need to do that.
Fair enough. We hear a lot about company culture, right? It's a very, again, another term that's used in common corporate communication. What does company culture actually mean, and how can an organization really maintain a strong culture when employees are spread all across the globe?
Wow.
Really laid it on you there, haven't I?
I'm just thinking we're getting sort of quite well into this podcast, and I'd probably need a good half an hour to respond just to the first part of that question. Okay, so to me, the most important are the culture's a lot of different things, but I think more than anything else, it's about what employees experience from their organisation, and it's based upon the employee journeys they're going through, but the sort of broader context, digital and physical, and everything else that they work within as well. So it's a difficult question, but it's also an important and very topical question. And there's lots being written at the moment about organizational culture and the challenges sort of maintaining it and keeping a strong culture and so on. I must admit, for me, I think cultures have changed All cultures have changed. If culture is the experience has changed, and therefore the culture has as well. People access their organization differently. So, the purpose and the sort of core ways that leaders work, for example, they may be the same, but the behaviors of leaders have changed because they're now using more technology and so on. So cultures have changed, and a big part of that change has been that they've also become more diffuse, because when you're accessing an organization more via technology, and you're not meeting all of those sort of weak tie connections that we used to bump into, your sense of the organization is more diffuse as well, and you see consequences of that in things like, well, even things like quiet quitting. In a remote environment, it's easier for people to move between organizations because there's less change. When we were physically co-located, sort of moving from this organization in this building to that organization in that building, there's a big transformation involved in that. Whereas, okay, so yesterday I was having Zoom meetings with these people, and tomorrow I'm having Zoom meetings with those people. There's less of a change involved, so it becomes easier, and our sense of the organisation becomes less deep, less connected. That's not necessarily an issue, but I think we need to respond. We need to recognise that that's happened and respond to it in a different way. So I'd suggest, firstly, organisations really need to understand what's core to their culture. What are the things which are really important, and really, really go to town even more than we used to on making that stand out. So that's still felt by everybody, even in a different way. Secondly, that sort of networking type approach I was talking about before, I think that's even more important. Thirdly, we give teams more autonomy to develop their local cultures in the way that's appropriate for them, and that's all part of moving towards that greater level of autonomy and sort of more self-managed type approach I was talking about before, and getting rid of some of that organizational drag. So again, it goes back to paradox, doesn't it? It's about focusing on the things which are really important and making sure that's common, and then giving sort of more autonomy and flexibility to teams and people to do in their own ways. So culture's changed, and we just now need to sort of navigate around culture in a different way as well.
With the current global economic landscape, right, with recessions evidently looming all around the world, and also after the onset of things like the Great Resignation and so on, many companies now are shifting their focus towards how really best to retain and upskill their current workforce. So how can companies really help nurture the career growth and skills, the skill set of their workforce, their remote workforce even?
Okay, so so look, I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that the biggest questions in business these days are HR questions, like how do we ensure people are motivated? How do we help people learn? Really learn, rather than just go on a course and then leave the training without actually anything changing. It's another really big question with lots of different deep aspects that we still need to explore and get better at managing. But it again is more and more important for engagement. People want to progress and develop their skills, so it's a big part of the other conversation we've been having, and it's a big part of business effectiveness. Most organisations these days report that they're struggling to get the skills that they need, particularly for the future rather than today, and develop people's skills as well. So it's a big part of it. And my answer is largely the same, or at least built on what we've already been talking about. So it's being more proactive and intentional. It's being clear about the outcomes that we need to achieve. It's being more interested in how learning takes place and what gets in the way of it taking place, and it's providing different and appropriate opportunities for people to learn depending upon the skill or the knowledge or ability that they need to improve in. And it's using technology effectively. Um, Perhaps the equivalent to asynchronous communication in terms of engagement is flipped learning. I'm a big fan of flipping the way that learning takes place, because most learning, or at least most meaningful learning, the learning about those more important things that we don't have the data for, most of that takes place best through conversation, through people talking together, co-creating learning, helping each other develop and change what they do. So a lot of learning can be done asynchronously, and should be done asynchronously. It's allowing people to learn in their own time, providing them the tools, providing them the technology, and allowing them to sort of move on and get through a course. And then it's getting those people together to talk about the impact of the learning and the meaning of that learning and the actions they're going to take based upon that. And my academy is a perfect example of that. I set up the Strategic HR Academy at the beginning of the pandemic because prior to that point, I'd been doing lots of in-person, face-to-face training that I wasn't able to do anymore. So that was sort of the short-term stimulus to do it, but actually it was something I'd been thinking about for quite some time, because in today's digital age, the idea of getting everybody together in a classroom to talk to them or at them for a full day, is just doesn't make sense. It's much more effective to give people video-based lessons that they can study in their own time, ask questions in asynchronous chat as and when it's appropriate. And then when we get together, whether that's in person or via technology, we use that time for connection, for relationships, for conversation, for Q&A, for activities, and all the rest of it, the less meaningful stuff, which is still important, but it doesn't need that face-to-face time. We get all of that other stuff done in a different way. So I think that's, again, a little bit like my point on asynchronous communication. I think flipped learning is another piece that organisations really still need to get to grips with much better than we have.
That's great stuff, Jon. One final question I'd like to ask you before we end the podcast. It'd be really great if you could share maybe your top HR trend predictions of trends that you feel are really going to help drive employee engagement across a global workforce.
Thank you. And I did mention earlier that there were lots of trends and predictions around at the moment, and indeed I have published my own, which I don't have in front of me, and I'm not going to remember them all. I did think your question earlier about frontline workers was an interesting one, and sorry, I forgot to answer specifically around that, but that was one of my trends. We post-pandemic, we all stood outside clapping key workers, and then we refused to increase their salaries, and but the pandemic showed us the importance of those people rather than simply people at higher levels of the organizational hierarchy. Communication, learning, etc., all need to focus much more on the front line than they have in the past. People centricity was one of my other trends that we've already talked quite a bit about, and learning as well. We've talked about, and I've sort of talked about why that needs to sort of move up organisational focus as well. Making greater use of technology, and again we've sort of explored those issues. And so actually, I think we've responded quite a lot of the issues. Perhaps I could just go back to my first point, and just to say I think the one thing that underlines, well, perhaps two things that underlie a lot of the changes we're seeing now are, firstly, technology, particularly as a result of the pandemic and hybrid, but secondly, this need to get much closer to our people. People centricity, certainly in the HR world, is changing everything. So my academy is the Strategic HR Academy, because I set it up at the beginning of the pandemic. I think if I was doing it now, perhaps I don't know if I'd call it the people-centric HR Academy, but I'd have tried to sort of insert those words a bit more than perhaps I have. Yeah, life has changed, the world has changed, HR's changed, and it's getting closer to our people, which is at the core of that.
Brilliant, Jon. And listen, evidently, we could be speaking for 3-4 hours. I love your passion. Evidently, your years of knowledge and the insights that you've given have really come across very strongly, I think, in your passion. And I implore people to go and check out your Strategic HR Academy. Jon, it's been a pleasure having you on today. I hope everyone who's been listening and watching this has picked up a ton of great insights and also some very practical tips that you've shared as well about how to better engage with employees, how to better effectively manage communication, such as fewer meetings and more productive meetings. So I really appreciate your time. Jon, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time. And yeah, I thought your questions were great. Thank you.